And just say that your attendance is consent to our recording and later posting the recording of the next portion of the meeting. I want to introduce our guest speakers. We have Lee Collier and Scott Robb, and I'm trying to make Scott also give Scott a spotlight, and it's not letting me at the moment. We'll work on that, Scott. We'll get you up there. Oh, good. Thank you. Someone else did it. So Lee and Scott are both from OSPI. Lee is the Director of School Health and Safety, and Scott is the Special Education Parent Liaison. And I am just going to turn it over to them.
Thanks, Janice. Sorry, I'm moving around windows here. I should have done that beforehand. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to me here. It's nice to see everybody. I was told that I could do a similar presentation I did last year on mental health and sort of the intersection with disability. I will try to talk slower than usual, but I'm the worst at it. Again, I'll try my best for everybody. I know that's been an ask at every presentation I've ever done. So I'm here to go slower. Again, my name is Lee Collier. I am a white male with a sweet beard and black hair and glasses, and I'm the Director of School Health and Student Safety at OSPI. So I prior to this, I worked in special education, sort of the intersection of mental health and disability over there for a while, and behavior. And I've recently become the Director of Health and Safety, where I oversee a bunch of different programs related to behavioral health and school safety, school nursing, social and emotional learning, Healthy Schools Washington, Title IV. It's a whole barrel of stuff. It's really fun. I miss my friends in special education, but it's nice to be doing good work, doing other stuff too. And I'm here with my friend and colleague, Scott Robb. We're going to talk for a while about, Scott, do you want to introduce yourself before I start rambling? And yeah, why don't you go?
Sure. Thanks, Lee. This is Scott speaking. I appreciate that. Yeah, I use he, him pronouns, middle-aged white male, blonde hair, and wearing a dark shirt today. I work in the special ed department, used to work with Lee. It's nice to be back here. I know I've been to speak with this group before, so I appreciate that as well. And my role at OSPI is still the same, parent and community liaison. So I do what I can to help folks navigate the system, and hopefully I can play off of some of what Lee is going to talk about, and then I can kind of fill in with a little bit of what the special ed angle to all of this may bring. So I'll take a backseat to Lee to start.
Yeah, I shared a lot of these slides with you all last year, so I'm going to share them again and be available to answer questions at the end. We're really happy to kind of spitball on whatever topics anybody would like to discuss, and feel free to throw them at us when we're done. And you can also interrupt me. I'm an excessively casual person, so please feel free to do that as well. And I'm going to share there. You should be able to see my other screen. Great. So we are still in a pandemic, and we're still returning to school. That process is still going on. So not only, what we've noticed as a state system is that our children who were struggling beforehand are still struggling, and the kids who were at risk of struggling before are also struggling. So we took a pyramid that was about 3 to 5% of our kids, and it's now full at like 7 to 9% of our kids are now really struggling. And that's true across our state. There's not really communities who have been salvaged from the impact of the pandemic. So what's happening, and I kind of want to normalize a lot of it, is that these are normative sort of child and adolescent reactions to stress and trauma, right? We know that children have had major disruptions. They have had the loss of caregivers, loss of family members, And loss of routine. I think we actually don't acknowledge the trauma of the loss of their routine and how significantly impacted that was for many, many children. So we're still in that. This is going to be something we're dealing with for the next few years, and it's coupled with a couple of other issues going on. I think the thing to remember is that this is going to have an impact. If you look at Katrina, what happened after Katrina, students who were displaced by Katrina were about 4.5 times more likely to have symptoms consistent with serious emotional disturbance, which is just the term the researchers used at the time. It was, so 45% of parents said their children were experiencing emotional problems, did not have prior, and 52% thought their children needed professional help for these problems, but did not receive it. The thing I did remember is that no two disasters are alike. Multiple factors are involved in this, and students look to teachers, right, for encouragement. They look to teachers for stability, look for teachers to know if everything's okay or not. Districts become a beacon in many ways for whether things are working or not, whether my community is functioning or not. And they really are that for many of our communities. I have a question on, are you encouraging school districts to improve access to counseling as part of the IEP for students with severe anxiety? Yeah. We are at a provider shortage across the board for mental health. We don't have students with disabilities also are struggling to get services for mental health. All students are struggling to get services for mental health. This is a universal problem across our system. So yeah, we'll talk about mental health and IEPs pretty specifically. And I think there's more we can do. And I think I'm definitely willing to sort of think on what that can be with regard to technical assistance in districts. I want to just just an overview of what is trauma, right? Trauma is something that happens to a person that has lasting effects on their function, mental, physical, social, emotional, and well-being. There's different types of trauma that have been identified by researchers, and every one is different and impacts students differently, right? We know about children who are young is that trauma impacts brain development. So that's stress. That's what trauma really is. It's stress, right? It's acute stress turned up, right? And when the students are younger and their brains are developing, that stress impacts brain development. It causes delays, it causes irritability, it causes symptomology, right? And then also can impact memory, emotions, and then overarching responses to stress can be impacted by previous stress, right? And all children react to trauma differently. There's, children who have had the same event occur to them can have incredibly different impacts from that. So I get really aggressive when people start to sort of compare, say, well, that happened to me and I'm fine. Well, cool, you're you. That's great, but that has nothing to do with how this is impacting a child or how this is impacting someone else. We don't get to play competitive games with that. How this impacts people is really, really different, and depending on a lot of different things, as we can see. Right? You'll hear the term ACEs a lot, adverse childhood experiences. There's a big study that looked at them in the late 90s, early 2000s that surveyed, I believe it was 10,000 adults in this original survey. It's been done a lot other ways, replicated many different ways, but this original one's really famous. And it surveyed these 10,000 adults, looked at impact of trauma over time, looked at the impact of these, what they called ACEs, these traumatic events that occurred in their childhood and how they impacted them over their lifespan, right? And they saw things across the lifespan that happened. Birth to 5, we saw what we talked about earlier, this disrupted neurodevelopment. Sort of 6 to 11, that latency area, we start to see social, emotional, cognitive impact. We see kids acting out, right? Some turning in, but many kids start to act out, often earlier too, but we start to see it really at 6 to 9 with trauma in particular. And then teenagers, we see the adoption of high-risk behaviors. And as they get older, we see disease, disability, and social problems. And of those 10,000 folks surveyed, there was half dead by 35 who had 4 or more ACEs. So 4 or more of these on the previous page listed. half of those in the survey were dead by service. That's the number we're playing with. That's the reality we're playing with ACEs. You see, the more ACEs have, the more trauma, the more negative things that occurred in students' lives. We see higher incidence of depression, higher incidence of suicide. In the state of Washington, here's actually what we're seeing with regard to ACEs specifically. It follows that same trend we know. This is a national trend around that same ACEs data. And if we look at within our state, this is from the Healthy Youth Survey statewide data from this past fall, that the more ACEs they had, we saw more symptoms of hopelessness, and more students reported that they attempted suicide or thought about, considered suicide. Sorry, they're actually, the number 2 considered is actually much smaller. But there's, there is good news. Trauma is healable. Trauma is, it's repairable. It's something we can deal with, something we can engage with. It's not a, it's something that can be worked on with children in particular. A really famous study called the Kauai study. I recommend everyone take it. It's available for free online. You just Google Kauai study trauma, it will come up. The details are right there. I sent this PDF to Janice, so she has it as well. But it looked at why students are impacted differently by trauma and how they heal, what happens if there were adverse childhood experiences in children's lives? How did they get better? How did they heal over time? So they looked at specifically, there were protective factors for the individual. So with little kids, that their temperament was actually different. That little kids who were active, affectionate, cuddly, good-natured were actually less impacted by trauma. They developed coping patterns and were more autonomous early on. In middle childhood, they were problem solvers. They weren't gifted, but they used their talents effectively, research said. I think this stuff's sort of fascinating. And there were protective factors within the family. How does the family support people? There was a close bond with one person, right? There's a close human connection with a person. That's universal across any sort of research. When you look at kids, there's always one adult who helped pull them through, right? There was some sort of religious, spiritual, or community connection that provides stability. Boys are, research called out boys specifically by saying that they need structure and rules and encouragement, emotional expressiveness. Girls, emphasis on risk-taking and independence. And I get there's limitations to that of the binary, but is what the research looked at. And then protective factors within the community. There's reliance on elders for emotional support, ability to seek out others. And teachers played a critical role. All high-risk children, all resilient high-risk children who had ACEs, who showed resiliency and less impacts of trauma, could point to one teacher specifically beyond their family, beyond their community, who was a specific support. Teachers who listened, challenged, and rooted them on. And there are clusters of these protective factors, internal and external, grouped together again. That's a review. So here's how schools can help. Here's what they do. You hear a lot about MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support. It's a public health model, right? It's just like medical care in many ways, but we're trying to do that with schools, right? All kids need, right, checkups, diet, vaccinations, hand washing, right? Everyone needs to wash their hands. We don't spread disease. That's a great tier 1 strategy. Some people might need medication or medical treatment or cavities filled, and a few might need a higher level of care, tiered, but not all. Right, so that's the same model we're trying to put into schools. How we organize things, how we think about things, and we want mental health to be the same way, right? We want there to be these sort of strategies that everyone's getting. We're identifying kids then who need a little bit more, and then once they're in that second tier, we're identifying them for more. Special education is, I want to be really clear that it's not tier 3. Special education is specific service for students with disabilities who need it. There are, we hear that, we get into a lot of conversations about that. Tier 3 is only, no, tier 3, FBAs and BIPs are tier 3, right? Functional behavioral assessments and behavior intervention plans, but special education is a service available to certain kids with disabilities. It's not specifically a tier 3 service. Special education functions in general education settings, right? I just want to try to bust some myths, doing some myth busting here today. And we're organizing resources to get kids help early, to do stuff that will work, and provide supports for all. And then that tier 1, what that looks like in schools is we're doing all of these things, right? This is the ideal, right? Different schools are on different paths to this at different points in this, but this is all the stuff that should be happening for all kids. And again, a lot of this is ideal, and a lot of this is different places and different levels of funding too, right? I hear a lot the term trauma informed, making things trauma informed. Things should be trauma informed. They should. But what does that actually mean, right? It acknowledges the impact of trauma, right? It recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma and responds to it effectively and resists re-traumatization, right? Does not put students in situations or positions that would re-traumatize them as an intervention, that they would avoid that, right? And then trauma-informed practice thinking, that we're lacking a skill, not intentional misbehavior. We're building missing skills. We're not shaming for lack of skills. We're nurturing. We're not criticizing, teaching, not blaming. Logical, natural consequences rather than punishment. That's the frame set we're trying to sort of form these kids into, right? Trauma and disability. We should be looking specifically at students' past experiences, their cumulative experiences and academic challenges, relationships, and then parent input. These are things we should be considering with all kids when looking at any evaluation, right? It should be, there isn't, just because you have trauma or have those needs doesn't mean you qualify, but we should be considering that in the qualification process, right? Doesn't make anything automatic, but there should be considerations being made, and that consideration should be documented in the evaluation. And Scott's going to elaborate more on this in a minute too. Can we build practices in the classroom? Can we engage the student in conversation? Can we encourage collaboration with others? Can we assist in identifying a trustworthy person in the school? All supports that you can be asked to do prior to increasing the need of service, right? And then for evaluation teams specifically, right, they should be considering the impact of trauma on their current behavior, duration of symptoms, the behavior relative to their peers, what classroom interventions have been tried, their relationship or relationships, and are there any additional interventions that may help me, any interventions in the home that are useful? Well, there's a lot of comments on the chat. I will go through them on our break, or when Scott's talking, then we can answer them in a minute. Trauma-informed evaluation. So a trauma-informed evaluation is just bringing the principles I'm talking about here and sort of embedding them in the evaluation process, right? The measures don't change. You don't instrument the kid. They don't take different tests, but we consider their impact of experiences on their test performance, right? We integrate their strengths as well as resiliency factors into the report. And the report should aim to be sensitive to trauma history by using language that removes judgment and writer bias, right? And acknowledge that, I think also just acknowledge the trauma, and the impact of that trauma may have on the family, right? Trauma is part of a family system. It's rare that it happens, but it's very often when a kid experiences trauma, there's vicarious trauma experienced by the rest of the family. There's a deep impact going on. Regardless whether they were there or it was episodic or chronic. There could be a lot of shame and blame and judgment involved in a lot of a child's trauma. So that's just something to always consider too, and to think about when you're talking about communicating with families. And I said this earlier, but trauma does not have a specific special education category. There's students with suspected trauma history who are diagnosed or demonstrating features consistent with PTSD. They often fall into emotional disability, emotional or other health impaired. Trauma can impact students without disabilities, no matter their diagnosis or disability category. I'm going to pass it off to Scott for this next slide. I'm going to stop share. You want to hop in and share, Scott?
Actually,
want me to drive?
Yeah, please.
I'll keep driving.
Thank you. I didn't have the
go for
whole thing set up.
Yeah, just say next and we'll be good to go.
Sure. But I appreciate the hand up because I feel like this is where Lee is the bridge from his background in special education to his knowledge systemically about how we can set up schools to be more trauma informed, recognize the existence of trauma, and then the relationship to disability. This is a special education group, so I know that I'm going to start by taking a step back and looking big picture, kind of as just an entree into the deeper conversation about mental health services and maybe what does it look like on an IEP when a student needs those services, a student who is on an IEP already, or a student who may be evaluated and in need of an IEP. Special education services, as you may know already, the criteria, there's those 3 criteria that really establish whether a student is in need of the services, and that's having a disability, the impact of the disability on the education performance and experience, as well as the adverse impact that creates such a need that it can't be addressed in general education exclusively. So that's where I think what Lee set the table or sets the stage really well, talking about if we have systems set up and it is not addressing the needs of some of our students who are on IEPs, then there may be a need further within the special ed system or within the IEP for that student to require specially designed instruction or related service connected to their overall program. So go ahead, next slide, please. Thank you. The IEP team, go through the process of considering what are the services that and accommodations, modifications a student may need while they're in school. And so these are the kind of things that IEP teams would consider when they develop an IEP generally, and consider with a lens towards the trauma that the student may have experienced. Next slide. And some of the questions that the team could ask when they are in the development process that really connect back to the things that Lee just talked about. When you're taking a trauma-informed lens, when you have an evaluation that looks at the impact of trauma on the student and what's that going to mean for the services that the student potentially would need. So next slide. Yes, again, a step back, a little bit of a review or just bigger picture. A student who's on an IEP, a student who's receiving special education services, is receiving specially designed instruction. And the definition there, straight from our state regulations, this is a visual I've used perhaps with this group before, where it just shows the idea behind something that's specially designed is where there's an intentional effort to create instruction that's adapted to meet the unique needs of the student. You're adapting the content of what's going up with the student's learning, or you're adapting the methodology or some aspect of both. It can happen in a general ed setting, of course, but when it comes to addressing the unique needs of the student, how do we specialize it? How do we make it unique so that it's addressing where the needs arise? Next slide, please. The related services is sometimes that piece that gets overlooked. In my experience, there was a really good question earlier about, perhaps what is OSPI doing to ensure that these services are more available to students on IEPs. I don't know that we can do anything to make them more available, other than the general support that we've talked for all students that we're talking about. But we have been, in my experience, very recently reminding as many people as possible, particularly in our field, that a related service is something that's there to assist the student who's on an IEP to benefit from the special education being provided. And straight out of the definitions in our state, the regulations we have, I've highlighted the terms on the screen that say psychological services, counseling services, social work services, even parent counseling. These types of services may stem or connect to the mental health needs of students, may address the trauma that students and families may be experiencing. So it's helped take a step back, I hope, to kind of see that this is the general framework for how special ed services work. And there may be students who are on an IEP who could be in need of these types of services. The framework allows for that, allows for specially designed instruction to address student needs and or related services as well. So next slide, please. How would you know the difference if you're sitting there talking with your IEP team? Because special education world, I know we have all these terms and we throw them out there. Oftentimes I hear families struggling with that. What an IEP team considers is what does the student need and how do we deliver it? If a mental health service, for instance, is needed to help assist the student to benefit from some of the other specialized instruction or related services that are happening, then that would be called a related service. It's related to the provision of special ed services. By contrast, if there is a mental health need and it's needed to assist the student to be able to access and meet general education standards, participate in the general education curriculum, perhaps then what they need is some kind of specialized instruction. And we would call something that looks like that on an IEP SDI, especially designed instruction. So next slide, please. This is a snapshot of, it's a poor quality snapshot, but it's more to just, if you've had an IEP, get your mind back to that idea that on a service matrix, which is a chart that would spell out what are the types of services a student will get. Typically an IEP will break it out that especially designed instruction, sometimes labeled special education, where it's going to happen. And then in this example on the screenshot, there's two rows at the top of the chart that show an example of occupational therapy as a related service. You could easily, swap in there any kind of related service that's there to assist the student to benefit from the special education that's already being provided. And so it's their related services are related to the instruction that's happening. And then you have specially designed instruction, which could be any number of areas that meets the student need. In this particular example, there are social behavioral supports where a student could be getting instruction to address the needs that arise from trauma that's been experienced. So next slide. If you're looking at your IEP tonight, how do you know the difference? Some typical rules of thumb. These are not any sort of hard, fast rules, but I'm saying that these are the sort of tips to kind of look for it. Especially design instruction is what requires measurable annual goals. Related services are not required to have a measurable annual goal. Caveat there is that some school districts and IEP teams can set higher standards for themselves, and they may choose to call something specially designed instruction that may be a related service on another student's IEP. It kind of depends. And they could also set the standard of we want to put a goal for this related service. It's perfectly allowable. When you're looking on your IEP, what are the kinds of things you look for? Measurable goals typically tie back to some kind of instruction. There's not always a clear line to distinguish between specially designed instruction and a related service, but what's the function? What role is the service providing to the student? And a good thing to keep in mind too, if you think that it's only related services a student has on an IEP, that may not be the case, because a related service, if a student only needs a related service, then they wouldn't be eligible for special education in the first place. Thinking back to the eligibility criteria, that it needs that can't be addressed in the general education setting alone. First, that's what requires specialized instruction. So thus, every student with an IEP should have some kind of specialized instruction. Related services are not enough. So next slide. I do have a case study that I found that hopefully we could use to kind of highlight some of this in action. This is a recent special education community complaint to our office, where we investigated an allegation from a parent that their IEP team failed to consider a request for counseling services to be added to the student's IEP. This was an elementary age student. I believe they were under the hard of hearing eligibility category. And And they had a range of services. They had a number of services, I think, related to their communication needs. So there was written language, there was oral communication, I believe, and there was math services as well. And there was also social and emotional services to support in the form of SDI, some sort of instruction to support the student around their social and emotional needs within the school setting. And at this point, the parents were making a request. The first request was made while the schools were closed during COVID, the onset of the pandemic. The second request was made upon the return to school. And the district was waiting at that point to evaluate the student because there was already an evaluation in progress that had been delayed. So at the same time, one of the factors that came up was, and part of the reason I think that prompted the family to maybe make this request, I'm not sure, but speculating there, is that there was a school-based counselor fluent in American Sign Language available as part of the general education offerings at that school. So going back to what Lee talked about, if there's a structure in place with multiple tiers of support, that was one of them already in place to address student needs. The student was showing some resistance to using this sort of general education service available. The evaluation came back and it did recommend considering counseling to support the student's emotional needs at school. And the IEP team decides not to add counseling services because the IEP team talked about it and said, students making progress that from the SDI that's already being offered. The student was receiving 200 minutes a week in social emotional instruction. And at the same time, there was one thing I thought that was interesting reading this was that the ASL, the school-based ASL counselor, recommended that they stop meeting with the student because it wasn't a good fit for what that counselor could provide. There was a recommendation for further mental health services. Well, the complaint came into our office, and next slide, please. The findings from our office at this point was that the IEP team, from a procedural standpoint, properly considered the need for a service and then documented their decision, including that the parents disagreed even that they thought counseling should be added. I mean, this is the snapshot in time in which the complaint came into our office. One thing that's important as a takeaway to know with students who have IEPs is that the IEP team really needs to have a discussion, particularly if there's a recommendation for mental health services, counseling services, or even further specialized instruction, say in social or emotional health, well-being. The IEP team has to properly consider that. And in this case, the IEP team did do that. They were able to document that they did. A good takeaway is that an IEP team is not required to actually provide every exact service that is being requested. But you do have to evaluate the student's needs. There's always that idea of having a comprehensive evaluation, going back to kind of what Lee talked about earlier, with a trauma-informed perhaps lens to what are the student's needs, and that the decisions should be based on student-specific factors. In this complaint decision, it was noted that progress was made on student-specific goals that were already in the IEP, and that there were multiple positive behavioral support strategies and accommodations included in the IEP, including some that were actually recommended by the same evaluator. And I read through this, part of the evaluation was around getting a functional behavioral assessment done for the student so that a behavior intervention plan could be written. That's where the positive behavioral support strategies were being infused all throughout this student's program. So I think this is a good highlight of an example where you look at the eligibility criteria for a student who's on an IEP. Student needs specially designed instruction. They could have a need for related services, and mental health needs can be addressed in a number of ways. particularly if the IEP team follows the process for doing a comprehensive evaluation using that lens of sort of trauma to examine how is the student impacted by the trauma that they may have experienced, and how does it interact with the disabilities that they may have, and what is the need for services as a result. Next slide, please. A common questions that comes up. This is a well-informed group, so I will kind of use some jargon getting into it in terms of procedures, but a common question I hear from families is does a reevaluation always need to occur to add as a related service like counseling? The answer is usually maybe. Related services are based on information in an evaluation, so that part is true. It's a very good question to ask. But those decisions are also individualized, and it's case by case. So you ask some of the questions. Does the current evaluation already support a change? For instance, adding counseling. In the complaint that we looked at as an example, there was already something in the evaluation talking about a need for counseling services or mental health services. So maybe another evaluation isn't needed in that case because it was already in the evaluation. The IP team could have added that service later rather easily. But they need to think about as a team, if you're going to add services, does this increase or decrease the amount of time the student is in a particular setting? So that's the change of placement, because now I've increased or decreased the amount of services. If that's going to be substantial, then that points more towards, well, maybe we need an evaluation. So it's case by case, and you have to think about what are some of the other student needs that may need to be addressed or further examined. The same kind of typical questions you would ask about a reevaluation. How old was is the most recent one? Is there any recommendations that are new information that is coming in? And is there possible even to do a reevaluation reviewing the file? What's the existing data that already exists? So every time a reevaluation is done, you don't always have to have a formal or standardized testing instrument used. It can be done with basically a review of a file that the student has. Next question, or next slide with another question that comes up frequently is, what happens if my student's already receiving outside therapy? Typically, a response here is that a district wouldn't necessarily duplicate services that perhaps you're receiving privately, but that's really important information for an IEP team to look at, because it could paint a picture for how a student's mental health needs impact their educational needs. Going back to why they're receiving an IEP in the first place, there's an impact on their educational experience or even performance. So specific types of specialized instruction or related service in the school can be used to meet some of the educational needs that are arising. Some examples are listed on the screen about weekly instruction or sessions to de-escalation or anxiety in the form of either SDI or related service, positive behavioral support strategies, like in the example from the complaint that we talked about. Those things can be included in an IEP as a complement necessarily to, say, outside therapy that's happening. IEP teams could use the outside information from an outside therapy to help inform their own decision-making about what needs to go into the IEP, what kind of perhaps reevaluation is needed. The other kind of little more, I think, advanced approach, if you will, is look at whether the outside therapy is sufficient to meet student needs. And perhaps a wraparound approach starts to come to the forefront, where school professionals are working with some of the other types of providers who can do mental health services. And any one of those outside providers could be invited to an IEP team meeting as well. And so there's an opportunity there for collaboration in some respect if the needs sort of reach that level of intensity. And next slide, because it has one other question that I think happen, which I think speaks to the complaint example that I just talked about. What if you think that your student needs mental health services, but the district disagrees? Like, what would you do as a family or as a parent? My response would be to keep talking with the IEP team and consider making a plan to revisit that decision or discussion and move forward by monitoring progress and thinking about a reevaluation. One of the rights families has, I know I've talked about with this group before, and then you probably know, is that district has to document their decision. A prior written notice is the format to use, and it's a safeguard. So if parents have an explanation of the student-specific factors that an IEP team has decided not to add a service, for instance. The prior written notice can include why parents disagree and even some of the future plans to have perhaps revisit that discussion. As a family, though, going forward, if you're in disagreement with your district over these kinds of mental health services, you can prepare to think about how does mental health services connect all the way back to a student's overall ability to receive a free, appropriate public education. That's bigger picture. Again, that's the standard that has to be met by the school district. And that's for short, we call it FAPE, as you know, or you may or may not know, sorry. But that's the FAPE standard, is how do the mental health services factor into the student's ability to achieve an appropriate public education? And there's procedural safeguards that families have that can be used. An independent educational evaluation at public expense is one. If you thought the evaluation perhaps doesn't provide the information to talk about mental health services, or there's more formal dispute resolution like a complaint, like we saw before, or some of the others I can give examples of in a moment. And the next slide, I do want to go back to kind of what is FAPE and what is that standard, because if you're in disagreement with a school district, sometimes take a step back and talk about mental health services and how it's connected to a student's ability to make progress in light of their circumstances, in light of their disability. That's the legal standard that we operate under in special education. And there's resources to dive into that sort of legal side of it. But if you're in disagreement, how to connect it back to the progress the student is or is not making, and how the services, how mental health and the need for those services might have an impact on that. Next slide, please. Yeah. If you ever get lost too much in legal jargon, this is probably my favorite quote from the Supreme Court. I think that actually has the most applicability to parents, is that school districts have to always kind of show their work. The quote says that a court may be fairly expected to have school authorities be able to offer a cogent and responsive explanation for their decisions, showing that an IEP is reasonably calculated to enable a student to make progress appropriate in light of his circumstances, the student in the case identified as a male. Cogent is a word we don't use every day. Cogent means it's a clear, logical, convincing argument from a school district that's responsive to your request about mental health services, that explains their decision why it's not included in an IEP, or maybe we do need to include it. The complaint was a good example of where in that instance, the school district had a cogent and responsive explanation, or they followed the process correctly. And that's the visual on the screen, is sort of this IEP being a process, being a feedback loop, to where even if you are in disagreement now about the need for mental health services, you can still revisit that discussion by monitoring how the student is doing. Next slide, please. A word about kind of outside evaluations, because I know even in the example that we looked at with the case, there was a recommendation from an evaluator, and that evaluator was not a school district employee who made the evaluation in that case, as I read it. Outside evaluations are parent initiated or private evaluations. They are all relevant still. That information is something that needs to be considered by a school district and your team. Consideration means go back to the eligibility criteria. Consideration means how does this information shape or influence our understanding of the student's disability, the impact of a disability, and the need for services. And one of the safeguards I talked about is that independent educational evaluation at public expense is something that families can request if they felt like their evaluation from the school district wasn't sufficiently covering mental health needs, and there's some indication that it needed to. The next slide gives you sort of an overview of the rules around an independent educational evaluation. It's a procedural safeguard, so there's some steps involved in terms of if you make this request to your family, district has a timeline to respond. And if the district is not going to grant this request, the district has to be prepared to defend its evaluation kind of in the best way possible, or the furthest way possible, which is to a hearing officer. Next slide. Some of the other procedural safeguards are the more formal dispute options that if you are kind of stuck with working with your IEP team, there's ways to kind of work through it that involve trained mediators, IEP meeting facilitation, complaints to OSPI, or even a hearing. This is one really good group I know that kind of helps each other out when it comes to thinking about what does it mean to use these formal dispute options. But here they are. This is just as a reminder that they're the safeguards that come into play. That kind of wraps up what I wanted to talk about. And next slide is my contact information. And I think Lee has a couple resources for us as well to take away with you.
There's some questions about reasonable and reasonably calculated. I think that's a term used in the Andrew case, right, Scott? That was specifically from that decision.
Right. It is a term of art in some respects. Reasonable is going to be, I think, reasonable in light of the student's circumstances. So it says in the phrasing is reasonably calculated. So I think that's why you go back to that. You have to have a cogent explanation. So something is reasonable if you can provide a clear and logical, kind of convincing and responsive argument. You're being responsive to the actually needs that are being presented by the student. Then I think you're getting close. Then you could say, well, that's reasonable because it's actually addressing what the needs are for the student. It has some logic to it, kind of thing. And it's calculated to enable the student to make progress. Because the standard, remember, is not that every student has to meet every single goal on their IEP. That would be eventually unworkable. It would fall apart. But the standard is the school district has to have a direction, a path. The IEP team has to come together, use the information that they have to have a reasonable path forward. Like, it should be connected to what's the information that they have in an evaluation to have an IEP that's going to have services that match that. So that's where reasonably calculated, I think, comes into it. And there's going to be genuine disagreements over whether mental health services fit into that. But there's different ways mental health services could look. And that's why I think sometimes we take a step back and remember there's specialized instruction, there's related services. things are possible there.
So this is Janice. Lee and Scott, thank you so much. And I know, Lee, we've been collecting the questions from
Yeah,
the
I'm looking
chat.
at the docs right now. I sent it to Scott too, so we can both take a look at it. I'll just start at the beginning and go from there. That makes sense. Yeah. Are you encouraging school districts to improve access to counseling as part of IEPs for students with severe anxiety and depression, especially related to suicidal ideation and self-harming? I don't think we're specifically, I mean, I can't speak to specifically what special ed is doing to encourage it, but our messaging, I think, is very clear around, I think let me try to explain kind of how the system works a bit, right? We're a state with immense local control, and I really try not to blame local control for every problem I have in my life, though I would like to sometimes. We have more local control than other states. We actually have a really significant amount here. So as a state office, we actually can't tell a school psychologist their evaluation is wrong. We can't second guess their professional judgment. We can give technical assistance and guidance and reminders of the law, and we have a monitoring process that we're involved in, but it's a very convoluted system. So just as much as there are times I would like to tell many people to do things differently, particularly around this issue, which I have spent my entire adult life working in youth mental health. So I came from a state that had a very different system of care. I was a clinician providing services to students with IEPs and students without IEPs as a community-based provider. I ran programs for students with IEPs to provide mental health systems. So it's in this state is very different. I'm the co-chair currently of the Children and Youth Behavioral Health Work Group. We meet the first Friday of every other month, the even months. It's a public meeting. We have public comment. We'd love to have more. We have about 75 people who kind of show up and I would say party with us and talk about this incredibly important issue. We will be crafting policy for children, school-based mental health this summer. And supporting the system. The system is not equitable. The system does not work. The system is not serving all kids so equitably. We are working every day to help improve that. And we'll try to do our best to answer your question.
Yeah, one thing I'll build on that, I think that I could say from my direct experience is that what we more often do is the reminder that counseling and mental health services are possible on an IEP. Because I've been hearing the mythology, the rumor that, oh, we don't do that. We can't do that on an IEP. The answer, that is just flatly wrong. You can do that. There's nothing preventing a school district or an IEP team from making a decision that a student needs counseling as a part of their IEP. It's written in black and white in the regulations. So a lot of what I have had to do in my experience is a reminder to folks who do say that. And I know it's been talked about in other circles that I've been in involving administrators. I think administrators more at a senior level, like Dr. Torres, who was here earlier, I think he obviously would know that counseling is a potential related service or specialized instruction around mental health needs. It's when you start dispersing some of that knowledge down to the school site level, that it starts to dissipate a little bit. And there's, myths that get built up that, oh, we don't do that or can't do that on an IEP. A lot of what I have been doing, and I know my colleagues and experience has been trying to bust that myth that particularly now that we've all had this collective trauma, there's, I think, a renewed focus on the fact that counseling is possible. And I think the complaint is an example of the fact that school district has to follow their steps. They have to follow their procedures. And if that's something that needs to be talked about with an IEP team, then the school district has to be prepared to show their work that we did talk about this. We considered it. OSPI can't force them to change their decision if they say no, like they said. And there are larger systemic problems, at play in terms of equitable access to services. But at least from the standpoint of, is it possible? That's where at the state office, that's been our refrain over and over again. Yes, it is possible. We're going to bust that myth and first make sure that IEP teams are talking about it.
What to do with the issues of teachers and principals focusing only on academics and not social and emotional aspects of learning and relying on what they see and not internalized behaviors. I mean, that's a local issue, right? That's a conversation with your PTA, your local school, local level PTA. That's a conversation with your building leaders about what your expectations are for your school and your community. Our state doesn't fund mental health. I've said this equitably, right? So until the dollars are pumped into schools to provide to require them to provide this service, mental health services more robustly, we're all sort of playing catch up, but the system isn't properly, there isn't a school-based mental health system. We don't have one, it doesn't exist, right? So now everyone's scrambling to play catch up on this larger system. So I think that is about partnership and advocacy at the local level for sure. This is a great question. Can trauma-informed perspective be incorporated in the FBA bid process? It should be. Behavior-based approach does not necessarily consider past experiences. Yeah, I agree. I think there are examples of trauma-informed behavior intervention plans and that I think we could do a better job publicizing. But I think that's a larger conversation to have with my partners in special ed.
Just to add that that's the next frontier, I believe. Yeah. Yes, I had in preparing for tonight's discussion, I had one special education director, not from your district, from another one though, locally, that specifically asked me that question about how can we make our evaluations and how can I train or work with my staff to do more trauma informed or trauma, kind of based in evaluations. So, and kind of everything, or use that lens more broadly, I think, into everything that they're looking at with the students. So I think there's an area of growth, like field wide, I think, in this. So I think that's a great question. And I think Lee's response is spot on. It's very timely. It's exactly what I think is coming. And that's the next frontier as professionals as well.
Is anyone considering addressing trauma children experience due to restraint and isolation systemically as part of reintroduction of the repair process? Yeah, we have a work group that's going to be working between July and December that's going to release a report to the legislature specifically on restraint and isolation and the impact of trauma and how to infuse trauma responsive practices into schools. We are, the legislature gave us $200,000 to do that, to hopefully give you a document that you can bring to your district to say, hey, this is what we should be doing with our highest need students. I would say the FBA focus on the behavior that is distracting from educational process during classroom time, the focus on removing behavior from the classroom by understanding the functions of the behavior and replace it with different behavior. It'll be less distracting or increase the cooperative behavior of the child. Trauma-informed approach, I think, goes beyond that. It includes global issues, impacts not seen in school and observed in school. Yeah, I think the tip of the spear, I think, for us in our larger work in mental health right now for kids is really identifying children with internalized behaviors too. It's not just working with the kids whose behaviors are showing they need help, but really finding, and that's part of screening. That's part of that. That's really part of all this larger tier 1 system. I hope we can do a better job at supporting that. For children who are twice exceptional, especially those who are autistic, there are known risks regarding anxiety and depression. When is OSPI going to put forward guidance on these students with mental health needs? Continually, we see these students dismissed until they are in crisis within SPS. Do you have anything on that, Scott? I'm not really close to that work right now. I think we can take that back to our leadership.
Yeah, nothing specific. I mean, I appreciate the comment. It's not the first. I think it's a great comment. I think it's a great need that needs to be addressed. But nothing specific that I can speak to that, guidance is going to be coming out or being worked on. There's there's lots of areas to keep trying to address, but I think that's a comment that I appreciate and be able to take back as a reinforce the need for us to keep working on that.
Related services, when asking SPS regional directors shut down quickly within the evaluation meeting context of ASD, anxiety, dyslexia, depression, etc. How do parents ask in a way that is supported by OSPI that will get districts to listen? This is the $1 million question we've been kind of dealing with tonight, right? How do we, go ahead, Scott.
Yeah. I mean, I had that in mind when I used some of the examples from, our talk tonight. I think, my encouragement is to, yes, keep chipping away at it, like keep revisiting the discussion, because and find ways to tie it back into everything else you're seeing in the student's performance. And districts have to kind of show their work, like I said before. They have to be responsive to those kinds of things that you're requesting. If it's not already in an evaluation, though, I think that's a concrete area to talk about for evaluative purposes. Maybe we need a more formal evaluation to talk about this in a more informed way as an IEP team. But I would go back to kind of some of the examples from the presentation tonight in terms of how do I frame this need. Sometimes it is put it into a way of thinking as an IEP team. And then the thinking starts to perhaps shift over time as to maybe this is how we address the impact. Or maybe this is how the student is being impacted, and now we need the services to respond to that. So that's how I would use that.
Teacher here, we did get training on recognizing trauma in the classroom and how to help children with trauma. The training was focused on helping one child at a time. Teachers are experiencing about up to a third of their class experiencing severe trauma. Are there resources coming from situations such as Katrina that give us insight, strategies, and resources for helping children one at a time? I think I am trying to ring the alarm bell as loud as possible that we are in a massive crisis for students particularly around anxiety and depression. It has been said by our Surgeon General, it has been said by the federal government. I'm ringing that bell as loudly as I can with our state legislators who are interested in this issue. We are putting together through the Children and Youth Behavioral Health Work Group. We're hopefully going to put together a policy proposals that support the need that is actually happening, because we are not doing it as a state.
This group is a loud bell too. So, as Dr. Torres pointed out, yeah, there are folks listening to you.
What if the IEP team isn't educated or qualified to see a need for counseling? Scott?
Well, I mean, they could get that expertise. I mean, that's the thing to seek out. If an IEP team is having trouble understanding the need, I believe, I guess maybe that is the gist of the question. And that could be sought out. Perhaps I would say that's where I think it is kind of a chipping away at it. And I think that's where it's important to get their explanation on student specific factors as to why or why not a student does need a particular service. So I think that, right, not everyone's going to have in-depth expertise or knowledge or understanding of this, of the depth, say, like someone like Lee, who spent his career on this kind of issue. And teachers are being trained and asked to do lots of different things for all different kinds of students. So they may not have the depth of knowledge as an IEP team, but I think that if there is indications of a need, it's incumbent upon the district to still explain why they will or will not do something, and to seek out the kind of expert opinion, I guess, that you may or may not need to make those informed decisions. May not happen immediately, but I think that that's the standard still districts are held to, is to make sure that they're kind of covering all of their bases. They're looking at all the potential areas of need, particularly I think as a family, if you tie it back into what you're seeing in the students' experience at school, their overall kind of ability to make progress or make experience in the general curriculum. That's where you're tying it back into that bigger picture legal standard that makes the case a little more convincing that, this is relevant to the students, education.
Teacher here, is there a direct language a family can use that would trigger a mental health assessment by law, similar to asking for a special ed evaluation? No, there is not, that I'm aware of.
I mean,
there's
I
nothing
think,
similar. There's nothing similar to the IEP process. Go ahead, Scott.
right. I mean, I think the general standard that I advise families to use is to make sure the evaluation is sufficiently comprehensive. It has to be wide-ranging enough to cover all possible needs. If it's not comprehensive enough, then the district could have a problem with their evaluation. And I think you can ask for specific areas to be assessed as a part of that comprehensive approach to the student's needs. So those, that's legalistic language. If you were to go to a regulation, there is one that talks about sufficiently comprehensive evaluations. And if there's an area that looks like it's not being addressed, an area where if a student is not progressing the way that perhaps the team would have expected, or there doesn't seem to be a clear, logical approach to how to address a need, maybe there's not enough information in the evaluation or enough of information about the student overall.
Can you give an example of SDI for mental health that counseling service would support? Counseling is a related service generally. There's nothing saying it can't be SDI, but it's always been a related service in my experience. Scott, do you have anything to add to that? Yeah,
that it's typically a related service. I think that's why it's used as an example in the regulations that way. I have seen it typically connected with students who have emotional, behavioral, kind of social needs. It tends to be a little more of the extreme cases.
We don't see every IEP. There isn't a way to see every IEP. We actually see a fairly small percentage of them in our monitoring process, relatively. So we say things like just generally, typically, because we don't know exhaustively. But in my experience, I have only ever seen counseling as an IEP. What is SDI? And yeah, I think that's the same question. I have the same question. When the behavior is more internalizing than external behavior, so it appears on the outside there's no educational impact at school, even though private healthcare providers, the student family have provided input demonstrating there is internal educational impact during school as well as outside school hours. Can the school team make a decision regarding need based on external behavior during school hours only? That's a good question. I mean, Scott, you're probably better tuned to answer this than I am.
Well, it is possible, yes, that the team can address it. And I think that going back to the question, this is kind of why the question I pose that I frequently get about, like, what if my student is receiving outside therapy? What can the IEP team, what are they expected or have to do? For instance, because the IEP team is not seeing some kind of any impact on the educational experience or performance in a school setting. I think there can be a conversation about how does sort of outside needs or outside therapies or even recommendations from outside therapists, how can we still use that to address what the student needs in the form of, it doesn't have to be a related service, it could be in the form of accommodations, modifications to different school policies or classwork, different ways in which the student goes through their educational experience. There can be ways to kind of test it out or look for different things that are happening in the school setting that may not readily be apparent, but if we have an outside evaluator pointing to it, then maybe we can use that information to help inform the specialized instruction or related services that are already like it. Put another way, let's use the minutes that we already have on an IEP and use this as a kind of information to ensure that those minutes are being provided with that in mind, for instance. And maybe it doesn't look like SDI or a related service. It looks more like accommodations and modifications to the student, or some other supplementary support service that a student might need. So I think if you go back to that question of what if a student has outside therapy, for example, IEP team can still do something with it without duplicating what's happening on the outside. If a student has some sort of internalized needs or behaviors that the IEP team's not seeing, for instance, but is being identified elsewhere, that's still relevant information to use, and the IEP team can use it to take that kind of approach, or to examine how are we doing things in this setting that perhaps complements how we're trying to address things in other, or the student and the family are trying to address things in other settings, particularly with an outside therapist, for example.
And other states have, I mean, there's all sorts of advocacy in this space that could change how evaluations are done in the state. Texas, for example, uses educational evaluators in addition to school psychologists. So they have a whole core of people who are trained just to evaluate for special education, who are, it's just a more broad reach. So school psychologists can actually do more with their expertise than just evaluate for special education. So there's ways to look at it from other states. Our state definitely our state has a very limited view because we are limited by the legislation that says it has to be a school psychologist in our state.
This is Janice. I'm just going to jump in, being mindful of the time. I'm doing a little time check. It's 8:49. Our interpreters are here until 9. And we do have a little bit of PTSA business we'd like to do tonight.
Okay.
So Lee and Scott, if you can give us 5 more minutes, I don't know if you can. I'm trying not to impose on your time, but if you can, I think we could go 5 more minutes. And I can talk with you offline about how we address the questions that you're not going to be able to get to tonight.
No
and
problem.
What we can do, in terms of getting some responses back to the community.
Yeah, Janice, we can, if you can give us a week, we can definitely get some good answers to you. I think no problem.
Yeah. So if you want to, cherry pick 1 or 2 more, for another 5 minutes, up to you. And then, we'll do our little bit of PTSA business and
I see one here that I hear a lot, but I'm unclear on who provides counseling. The IEP team decides that a child should have counseling, but the school does not have the resources to provide that. What's the next step legally? The district is responsible. From the parent, but from what I know, one student that has counseling services in SPS, the counselors found, there's also there's some issues with how this is paid for with funding. Sometimes there's federal dollars that pay for certain positions, and their duties actually have to be spent on students with IEPs because that's how they're funded. So that can create a wrinkle. However, that does not prevent the student from receiving counseling services if they are identified in the IEP. Building resources are not a limitation. The FAPE is still the responsibility of the district beyond with who's employed at the building. There's still an explanation. They still are expected to provide FAPE within that, but we are at, again, there's a massive workforce issue going on in this space in K-12 and in mental health. We do not have enough providers. If it was looking something recently, if we decide, let's say every kid who's in a contained classroom in the state, right? Kids who are in these special classrooms designed for students with high needs in behavior. If we gave every kid in those classrooms a social worker, we couldn't do it. We don't have enough social workers in the state to cover that currently. So we're at an impasse. There's a lot that needs to happen in this state, and there's a lot of advocacy and policy work that can be done. I think that answers that fairly. But no, there aren't. There's all sorts of reasons. I hear a lot of reasons why they can't. But that if the need is addressed, if the evaluation team decides the need is there, the resources are not a limitation to that.
This is Yana. I'm sorry to interrupt. You said if the evaluation team decides.
Yes.
I thought that it's the IEP team that decides on these services.
Sorry. Yes. The evaluation team approves the. You're right. Thank you for correcting
that. Is how it happens. Evaluation team was just today trying to tell me what the evaluation team needs to discuss, and I had to remind them it's an IEP team decision. It happens.
It is
all
an
the
it is an IEP team decision. You're absolutely right. Thank you for catching that, Yana.
Okay, this is Janice. Do you want to take one more? Lee,
I
or-
got one here. Our daughter, 10th grader, has ADHD, dyslexia, dyscalculia. Schools know she has ADHD since she's been diagnosed in 5th grade, but has never been accepted in an IEP and has never received services. How can she get an IEP and the school admits she needs support? We've been requesting specific support for years, and high school counseling team has said the counselor has 200, 300 students, requires meetings, but not answered when parents cannot approach the building due to COVID. Yeah. What do you think, Scott?
As I understand the question correctly, that
She has a series of diagnoses, has not been approved for services.
right, has not yet been found in need of the services. Right, and that would say that the criteria for that last part hasn't been met. That whatever needs are being exhibited, there seems to be disagreement over whether the general curriculum, can address that.
Yeah.
And whether the student needs the specialized instruction or related service or not. The specialized instruction more specifically. First and foremost, I would make sure that that student is on, or at least considered for a Section 50, a 504 plan. And that's a whole nother evening's discussion. But at least that's where the general education setting and the general curriculum, there could be accommodations, modifications built into how the student accesses the general curriculum. Because that seems to be the rub there in that situation, is that the school team doesn't see a need for specialized instruction. And so exactly why that, I think there's room to explore exactly why the student doesn't need specialized instruction. School district still has to explain themselves as to why. And sometimes putting it in that language of, why doesn't my student need specialized instruction? And they can explain it. Well, what does my student need? My student does, it's clear the student needs something given the diagnoses and the impact. Let's talk about then, accommodations, modifications to this general environment, and then keep revisiting, the original decision. Because if the student is not succeeding in the way that you would expect with accommodations, modifications to the general environment, all that's doing is making more of a case that specialized instruction is perhaps needed down the line. So right, I mean, that's the determination, I think, of the line between a student who has an IEP and a student who doesn't, is that going back to that need for specialized instruction in some way.
So this is Janice. I want to thank Lee and Scott again. I want to just say also, for those of you who were at our meeting last month in April, Representative Jerry Paulette joined us to talk about some areas that he's interested in studying and looking into, proposing some new legislation in the next session next year. And one of them was around evaluations. And he's going to be doing outreach in the community to learn more about what the issues are that our families are experiencing with respect to evaluations, and having conversations with the community about possible legislative proposals. So I just wanted to throw that out there, because we'll be talking to Representative Paulette about that. And again, Lee and Scott, thank you so much. Thank you also for volunteering to get us responses to some of the questions you didn't get to tonight. We really
Our pleasure. We're on the same
that.
team, We're
Yeah, we so
Well, thank you,
appreciate
Janice.
hard work.
We so appreciate you. And last but not least, in the 3 minutes I have left, thank you. In the 3 minutes I have left, I am going to ask someone who is a member. This is for members only of the PTSA. Our meetings are open to everybody, but when we have to take a vote, only people who are members are entitled to vote. So I'm going to ask someone who is a member of the PTSA to make a motion to approve the minutes of our last 3 monthly meetings. We're a little bit behind, and that's why I want to get it done tonight. So we're approving the minutes of the February, March, and April meetings. Links were sent in the newsletter. And so I'm going to ask now for someone who is a member to make a motion.
This is Cheryl Lynn. I move that we approve the 3 months of minutes you just outlined.
Thank you, Cheryl Lynn. That's the monthly meeting minutes for February, March, and April. Can I have a second to the motion?
This is Christy DeVotter. I second.
Thank you, Christy. Does anyone have any questions or comments about those minutes that they want to raise? Okay, seeing none, I'm going to ask those of you who are members of the PTSA to vote by using the reaction button on the bottom and raising your hands. And I am going to stop the recording, which I should have done previously.